Hi everyone, Falling Up 90 here, and today I'll be doing a classic model train review of the Mantua 442 in the variants of the Pennsylvania Railroad number 7002. So first I'll be talking about the prototype, and then I'll be talking about the model itself, and finally I'll have the locomotive run around the layout a little bit. Now before I get started, I want to make a disclaimer that this is a locomotive from 1986. I will not be comparing it to a locomotive from today, as it's kind of unfair. So what I will be doing when reviewing the model is that I'll be looking at it at a perspective from 1986, as if this were a brand new model, and any issues that might be relevant from back then. So with that said, let's get started. It's interesting to bring up the prototype because it's not as original as it may appear. The model you're looking at is obviously the Pennsylvania Railroad number 7002. It should be noted, however, that the model is based off of the current version of the actual 7002 that exists today. There was a time where there was another 7002, but in today's age it's long gone. So the 7002 that exists today is actually former Pennsylvania Railroad number 8063. The former 7002 and 8063 are both Pennsy Atlantics, both built in 1902. Both have slide valve cylinders, Stephenson valve gear, but there is a significant difference between the two. The original 7002 was built as an E2 class Atlantic. It was one of 88 in that class, and its most distinct feature had the radial stay firebox. The 8063, however, was built as an E2A class Atlantic. It was one of 93 built in that batch. The most distinct feature was its then experimental bell pair firebox. On June 20th, 1905, the original 7002 became famous as it was known as the fastest steam locomotive ever, hitting 127.1 miles an hour and at one point averaging 3 miles in 85 seconds. This wasn't an official record as there was no hard proof, but there is minor evidence and the Pennsy still stands by it, so the locomotive will be a historical reference from this point out. By the late 1910s, both locomotives received mechanical upgrades. The original 7002 was reclassified into an E7SA. It was one of 14 locomotives in the E2 class to be converted into this new class of the E7SA. It received piston valve cylinders, increased cylinder size, and superheating. The 8063 was reclassified into an E7S class. It was one of 90 converted from the E2A, B, and C class. It received the same upgrades as the E7SA class did, but it also received some cosmetic changes as well. This included the electric headlight, keystone number plate, marker lights on the pilot beam, and the distinct chicken coop slat pilot. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find any images of the original 7002 once it received those mechanical upgrades. So all I can say is that at least it received mechanical upgrades, but I have no idea if there are any changes to the distinct looks or not. Both of these locomotives were used by the Pennsy for passenger trains. But once trains got longer and got heavier with the advent of steel coaches, it was very common to see these Atlantics doublehead to pull these same trains. And they would last that way into the 1930s. In the late 1930s, as the New York World's Fair was slowly approaching, the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to take a couple locomotives to represent the railroad, and that included the original 7002 for its feat back in 1905 of going 127.1 miles an hour. Unfortunately, the original 7002 was already scrapped. In search of an alternative, number 8063 was elected to be reclassified and renumbered as number 7002. Before the 8063 could be sent to the New York World's Fair as number 7002, it had to receive some cosmetic changes, and that included the oil headlight, the cowcatcher, and the round number plate. This might give us a hint that maybe the original 7002 had this appearance after it was reclassified by 1920. The new 7002 was on display at the New York World's Fair from 1939 to 1940. In 1948, it was also on display at the Chicago Railroad Fair. Eventually, it made its way into preservation and was sent to the railroad's historical collection in Northumberland, Pennsylvania. From there, it was sent to Strasburg, Pennsylvania in the late 60s. There would begin the new life of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, and the locomotive would be displayed indoors from that point on. But little realized this would actually be one of the most unique steam locomotives to make it into the preservation era. Before the locomotive was sent to the World's Fair, it was first sent over to the railroad's repair shop in Altoona, Pennsylvania. There it received Class 3 repairs in 1939, but the railroad had no intentions of firing it up. This was quite possibly the last example of a locomotive fresh out of a major railroad's repair shop during the height of the steam era. The stables were still shiny, the tubes still had machinist stenciling on them. The newly machined safety valves hadn't even had their seats lapped in. The injector nozzles never had water flown through them. So even though the Pennsy never had any intentions to run this locomotive again, they sent this to the World's Fair as a like-new engine. And making it all the way into the preservation era, this may have been the only one of its kind, and something really special that can almost never be seen in any other locomotive that survived. In the early 1980s, the Strasburg Railroad leased the Atlantic from the Railroad Museum in Pennsylvania. Because of its like-new condition the locomotive was still in, it only took 4 months to overhaul the locomotive and return it to the high iron in operation. 7002 would be in operations again in 1983, but just 2 years later it would start making appearances on the ex-Pennsy main line for excursions with counterpart 1223. They would make a couple excursions to Harrisburg and back, and even once to Philadelphia's 30th Street station. 7002's last main excursion run was to Gettysburg to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address on November 19, 1988. 7002's last run will be to Harrisburg with 1223 to make an appearance for a Prudential life insurance commercial. And a little known fact, Bryan Cranston makes an appearance in at least one of those commercials. By the late 80s, Strasburg Railroad's own number 89 was freshly shot and was sent over to the engine house. But that was when there was an overabundance of steam locomotives in the engine house, as only so many can be stored inside. Number 7002 was sent across the street to be on display, but potential to come back to service. In late 1989, however, Strasburg Railroad's new ultrasound testing revealed that the firebox was too thin for operations. It wasn't so much that the locomotive was damaged or worn down. This was a design flaw, as Pennsy applied this thin firebox layer to many of their steam locomotives. The same problem applied to 1223. Since the railroad did not own these locomotives, and the museum did not want the historical fabric of either of these locomotives to be altered, the decision came to permanently retire the 1223 and 7002 and have been displayed indoors in the museum ever since. As for the 7002, it was definitely a treat for those who got to see it run during the 1980s, whether it was on Strasburg's line or the Pennsy main line during the excursions it ran. But in my personal opinion, I think it would have been outstanding to see a locomotive today that was freshly shopped from a major railroad during the height of the steam era and not have been touched since. It would definitely have been a unique locomotive, and I think that would have been amazing for historians. But, you can't really argue with seeing a locomotive operate in the preservation era. It's a great locomotive and all, but I kind of wouldn't mind if it had another locomotive been restored to run instead of this one. But that's just my opinion, though. I still think that having the 7002 up and running was pretty cool. It didn't exist for operations in my time, but still, we get to see videos of it and it looked really cool in operation. So that's about it for the history of the 7002. Now let's move on over to the model itself. Mantua first released this locomotive in 1986. It will be their second locomotive released under the reconfiguration of the company. It came in both kit and ready-to-run form. The kit was $89, while the ready-to-run version was $128. And keep in mind, this isn't 1986 money. Alright, looking towards the front of the locomotive, you have the headlight, which is an incandescent bulb in there, the round number plate, some handrails, which is applied to all over. You have the coupler cut bar, the cowcatcher, and this pilot beam, which I really like because it has the pinstriping to it. Now, another really nice feature that Mantua had, which was a first of their locomotives, was these marker lights. Not only were they present, but they also lit up when the locomotive was in operation. Okay, looking at the side of the locomotive, there's the smokestack, the sand dome, the brass bell, the steam dome with the pop-off valves and whistle, and a steam generator. You also have this really nice handrail right here. The builder's plate supposedly goes right there, although there's nothing representing it for the locomotive, so those who do want to have a custom one made, it goes right there. The air pumps are located approximately right where the 7002 has its actual ones. The locomotive also has the corrective valve gear for 7002, as it has the Stevenson valve gear. The lettering on the cab is really nice. I like the pinstriping, and this has the exact font that the actual 7002 has. Now, the trailing wheel here is kind of indifferent. It's not independent from the locomotive, but fixed on. So if you want to determine the minimum radius of the locomotive, it's based off of the distance from the front drive wheel to the trailing wheel. It doesn't go side to side or swing out, but it springs up and down. So it's something that has to be sort of determined when you want to run this on a narrow radius. You have to make sure that's going to accommodate this entire length. There's not much for backhead detail, as it's completely blocked off, although that's where the motor would be located. And if you compare this to River Odyssey locomotives at the time, they had a lot of their locomotives had their motors stick out, from behind the backhead. This, I really like that Mantua had just a nice clean cover to not make anything look really obtrusive, so I really appreciate that. Between the locomotive and tender, there's two sets of wires that run between the locomotive and tender. There's also a plastic bar that's screwed between the locomotive and tender, so it safely pulls along the locomotive without relying on the wires. And I like the footplate that they added here. Looking at the tender, I really like that pinstriping. And I also like the riveting that goes on the sides of the locomotive. And the truck detail is really nice. The top of the tender is kind of funny, because not only does the light bulb stick out from the fixture, but it looks like the coal load is almost empty. Let's verify that this is the separation between the coal and the water. Not completely sure why they did this, because almost every other model would have a full load of coal, especially other Mantua models. Overall, I really like the appearance of this model. I think it's a really good looking locomotive and definitely captures a lot of 7002. So let's go ahead and have this in operation. One issue I do have is with the packaging. So obviously this is the one that originally came with the locomotive. You have a blue box with a plastic window so you can see what locomotive it is, but the styrofoam casing is only going to cover the locomotive from side to side. It actually becomes shrink wrapped when it's a brand new unopened locomotive, but once you take it out of the box and take it out of its styrofoam packaging, it's always going to be completely open. And this thin layer is the only thing that really protects the locomotive from the outside. Personally, I don't think this is a very protective box. I definitely think Mantua could have done better with that. And they have done better with later models being in much more protective foam casing. So if you do want to get this locomotive and, store it safely, or if you're traveling somewhere to take it with you, I definitely recommend wrapping this locomotive in bubble wrap. It'll be a lot safer than this. Although it's nice to have the original box, especially showing the original MSRP and then sale price. This is more of a nice historical collection thing rather than a nice protective box for the locomotive. So definitely recommend with the bubble wrap. So overall, I think this is a fantastic model. Mantua knocked it out of the park with this one. It's got really nice details, got some really good features, it performs relatively well, and can pull a decent sized train. So it's a really nice model that really resembles 7002 pretty well. If you're interested in other Pennsylvania Railroad 442s, the only other options would be the Bowser kit, which is only available as an E6, and the brass models. And the brass models are obviously not going to be anywhere as low price as this one. But for those interested, there's actually a model of the 8063 when it was in its modern appearance before it turned into this style. So it includes the electric headlight, the keystone plate, and the slat pilot. Those do come out in circulation every once in a while, but they'll definitely fetch a pretty heavy price. As far as this model though, I can't give a good price point on this one. It definitely varies, especially in the condition, although it's hard to say if you're going to find a brand new unopened model of this 35 years later, but it's entirely possible. So that about wraps it up, and thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.